You hear me okay? Yeah. Awesome. So thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me here at Reef. I'm from Florida. I went to Florida State. I'm from Plantation, and so it's very lovely to be home for a little while with perfect weather and almost perfect seas. A little rough, but I survived, so I felt great. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about tanks, right? And I think when we think about ocean science, a lot of times we think about being on the ocean. That's really what people seem to really enjoy. But a lot of the work in conservation and knowing the ocean happens actually outside of it. And it happens outside of it because it's very hard for us as humans to live long term in that environment and to watch animals and things like that in the environment. It's not really salubrious to our survival. I'm a historian and a sociologist of science, and so I come at this from two different perspectives. One is that I'm a historian. I go into the archives, I interview people, and I'm generally interested in how scientists think about and know the ocean. So I study you, basically. And then I'm also a sociologist, or you might say I use anthropological methods, and so I go into spaces, I watch what people are doing in laboratories and aquariums. I generally don't ask them what they're doing, I just creep on them. And then eventually I'll try to figure out, what did you do, and why do you think that you did that thing, right? And so I wrote a book about tank craft, right? And so how people use tanks, how they build them, and how they extrapolate from the tank to the larger ocean environment. So how is it that we have done all this work in a laboratory or in a space that is a tank, and then we go, yeah, that seems right. That's probably what happens in the ocean, right? And there are people that are like, no, that's not, that's not true at all. But it gets really slippery. And so tanks are really important. One, just because of visibility. There are just certain things that over time you see in a tank that you might be able to see in the ocean if you're looking for it, but you wouldn't know it's there unless you're looking for it, right? Long-term study is exactly what it sounds like. You're just gonna be able to look at things a lot longer and figure them out. And also you can change variables, and we'll talk about that just a little bit. And then maintenance, and that's one of the bigger ones that we will be talking about more as we start looking at coral. Maintenance as in trying to maintain and conserve coral, but also just trying to keep them for an extended period of time, the kind of ARC mentality that we're building right now, for better or worse. So I'll show you visibility. This is one of my favorite images, and people are always like, oh, that's uncomfortable. This is probably one of the first pictures that we ever have of a hammerhead shark. They're very hard to take pictures of with early photography. So this is from the New York Aquarium in 1901. And it is obviously dead, but this was just a revelation in 1901. And it's actually, this is two things that make it very important. One is that it's the first time you see a shark. The other one is it's actually technologically very difficult to shoot at this time through glass. And so this is photographer hobbyists and tank people working together to figure out how to kind of view these things. It's also very important because photography can travel a lot further than tanks. And so if you can take a picture of a tank, you can send it to someone, right? And so knowledge is gained through that. This is the oldest public aquarium in the United States. If you say that, people might get mad at you because there are some fights about it, but this is the Woods Hole Aquarium, and it still exists. It was competing for a while with the Belle Isle Aquarium in Detroit, which it went out and then it kind of came back. It kind of exists. But this is the first kind of long-term public aquarium that we saw around the exact same time. And then maintenance. We haven't been maintaining stocks that long, and that's one of the things that I'm going to talk about today. But this is a program for white abalone at the Aquarium of the Pacific. It's not on view. This is something that they do, and it's actually so private that they are outplanting them. They're actually releasing them, and they're not telling anyone where they're putting them because people will go and harvest them. And so I'm showing you this picture, but you're not supposed to know anything about it, but it's very exciting. So one of the things that I do is look at who kind of makes knowledge with tanks. You can tell I am a historian and definitely not a graphic designer. Like I said, I was watching people, I was like, ooh, you guys are good at stuff. But basically, I look at how these three groups make knowledge and work together in a very particular way. And so this is a set of communities that have done a lot. This is a thing that a network that I'm tracing for ornamental fish production. And so if you look at it, you have someone like a home aquarist. This is the article that Martin Moe used to say that he had done clownfish, closed the cycle on clownfish breeding for the first time, and you can see all his little baby clownfish in there. And at that time, he really was a hobbyist. He also did start a company for this, but it went out of business. A lot of that knowledge was pushed into academic research. This is a picture from the UF Tropical Laboratory, and this is one of their communities that they're trying to get to breed. They can't quite figure out what makes them become a breeding community, so they're still working on it. They change the variables every day. These pipes, we're supposed to make them feel better. No one's quite sure if that's working or not. They're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And then they kind of push it to aquarists. So this is from the St. Lucie County Aquarium, and they only have one tank of Pacific fish, but all of them are captive bred. But the reason that this is really interesting is this is the first of that particular fish to be captive bred, and you can see there's something with its feed that wasn't working 100% correctly, and its whole facial features are clear. And they were trying to feed it, and it actually was filling in that coloration, but by the third captive bred cycle, they had figured it out, and now they look quote unquote normal. But they keep this tank there. So this is kind of a community. They're all working to get together to really create knowledge. And in the process, they come up with an understanding. What do fish eat? What makes them breed? How often do they breed? And what are the variables that they need for that? And really, these three things should be kind of pushed together. It's very rare to find someone that works at a public aquarium that hasn't been a hobbyist before. They often move into academic research, and the same thing, lots of hobbyists and academic researchers. So Jamie Craigs, who I'll talk about in a little while, works on coral. He's an academic researcher. He works at an aquarium, the Horniman Museum, and he also does an enormous amount of work on his tank at home in his kitchen. Right? So it's not really clear that you can separate those, but it's good to recognize that they're all equally important in understanding how tanks work. So I don't have to kind of belabor the point about the threat to reefs that we have right now. So obviously bleaching events. I just use this. This is actually oil. Spill, but I think just human encroachment more generally, right? I was trying to find someone stepping on a reef while they were snorkeling, because that's a thing we see in Florida quite often. And then white band disease, right? So all of these things are not just hurting the Atlantic reef, but pretty much all over we're seeing, obviously, problems. And so, you know, what can you do? What can tanks do? Shouldn't all the work be focused in the ocean, right? But tanks can be really important here for saving coral, obviously in conjunction with other conservation efforts, right? So I'm never going to say we should definitely do all of these things. Visualization is incredibly important to the way that people see and study coral. Tanks allow long-term study and help us kind of understand what we would even need to do to save them, right? And then they can be repositories for coral maintenance and breeding. There's a big caveat here, which is they're relatively new technologies. So in the history of tanks that I tell, which starts in about the 1880s, when we start to develop what I would call modern aquariums, corals are way off. My story here starts in 1961, right? And so you have almost 80 years of there not being coral in tanks. They're hard to keep, they're finicky, they're slimy when they're unhappy, which is really uncomfortable. And so it is really important to understand the history of tanks, because if you didn't know better, you'd think the technology was just easy and it worked. We've done it, why can't we just keep doing it, right? And so history can really help us understand how new these technologies are and how they developed alongside problems that they're meant to fix, right? So it's not as easy as just saying, well, now we can do it, we should do it, let's do it. So we'll start with visualization. I'm going to tell you the history of how we learned to visualize things. This is a gentleman named Lee Chen-ing, and this is a picture from 1961 from Tropical Fish Hobbyist magazine. And he wrote a 2-page article, which he sent in, and he said, I managed to keep this reef tank alive. And the way I did it is just it's gonna make you so happy. And so he wrote a whole article and he calls this Nature's Plan. It's the first time that someone had suggested using live rock, which is not sterilized rock, and live water. And people, they were just very excited. But then they said, well, how am I supposed to get those things, right? He was writing from Jakarta at the time. And so people said, this is fine, but this is not something that we can do in a different area. In 1964, this gentleman, I love this picture more than anything really, but this is René Catala. And so he worked for the fisheries department for the French government. And they sent him all the way to a little island called Numeo on top of New Zealand. Okay, and he and his wife, Ida Catala Stuckey, decided that what they really wanted to do was start an aquarium. And so that's what they did with the French government's money, is they started this aquarium. And it was kind of perfect because there was this lagoon around it, and it was really easy to collect coral. But no one had really done this before. And so René collected coral, and he was the first to kind of keep it long enough to realize that they bioluminesced. And was very proud of this. So in 1964, he wrote a book called Carnival of the Sea, in which he said, coral do this, and you can also keep coral. The big thing that both of these gentlemen did was they figured out how to move coral safely, or as safe as you possibly could. And so a lot of the reason that coral wasn't surviving in tanks is because it was too sensitive while it was being brought up, right? And people were kind of mishandling it. So both groups, Ng and Catala, basically suggested that you take something down, you raise it up, and then you bring the coral individually in boxes on a transportation device. You go as slow as humanly possible, and then you let them sit for about a week in their own tank in the dark, right? To get them just totally comfortable. This was the way that they helped people learn to keep coral in tanks, and it really did work. Actually, the bigger impact that Ng had is a guy named Merrill Cohen contacted him. He was from Baltimore, and he was a pet dealer, and he invented the bag that we put fish in to take home from I bet you didn't know someone had to invent that, but he invented it. And he hooked up with Ng and told him, what can we do? And they started importing live rock, which was the bigger thing. And so people said, okay, that's actually really important. And so we started to be able to visualize tanks. This is actually a picture that's by Sven Fosse, and it's in 1985 in East Germany. This is probably one of the earliest, and he's just an awesome reef tank keeper. His name is Dietrich Stuber, and this is his tank in 1985. So from 1964 to 1985, people learned how to carefully package coral, how to get it around the world, and then how to learn to keep it, right? And it was a little bit of a fight, by the way. There are lots of arguments in here that I am skipping over, but if you want to talk about, how you fix your water, if you make your water versus live, all of that stuff, I would love to have a conversation with you about those. What happens is that once you can visualize coral, you can try to keep it comfortable and safe for a long time. You can study it. So for long-term study, I'm going to talk about a single tank. It does still exist. It's actually really close to here in the St. Lucie County Aquarium, if you want to go. I think it's a miraculous tank, and other people are like, oh, it's okay. But this is Walter 80, and he was actually a paleogeologist. Okay, he was particularly interested in what corals looked like a very, very long time ago. And he was also a hobbyist. And so he decided in 1980 to build a tank in the basement of the Smithsonian. And unlike his other peers, especially the Berlin group, he really wanted to focus on Atlantic reefs. And so this is the tank that he built. He wanted to use natural water clarification, so he invented something called an algal turf scrubber. If you want to get into a fight in an aquarium, just mention it. And so he built this tank, and he put live coral in it. It was the only Atlantic coral tank that existed at that time, and people hated it. Okay, they moved it into the Marine Hall, if you've ever been to in the National Museum of Natural History. And we get these written letters all the time that was like, the water is ugly, it's yellow, it's dirty. But the tank did relatively well. And in the process of keeping it, they learned all of the things about that particular coral tank and the maintenance of it that they needed over time. This is his wife and fellow aquarist, Karen Loveland. She was also a photographer for him, so if you ever have one of his books, she took all those pictures. And they're moving this tank in 1991, and so this is, again, them kind of reinventing and updating the idea of how to move coral. They're all individually in these containers, and they're keeping them. Also in this tank, you know, they discovered things that now we kind of take for granted. Fragging. This is them fragging in this tank, and they're just hammering things. It's fantastic. And then refugia, which were very important. They're just these spaces that they grow out their coral. But what's really useful about this space is, you notice, they have a lot of other organisms besides coral. And so the importance of having a robust ecosystem that's not just coral to help coral survive is also incredibly important in this type of tank. And then coral spawning. So this is what it looks like behind that tank. They have tide clocks for that tank. They have a traditional dump tank in there, so that's actually how they work it. And they also use, if anyone here is an aquarist, traditional halide lights over it. That's crazy. Like if you just want to cook it into a bouillabaisse, that's a really good way to do it. They're very hot. But that's the way it was built, and so they kept them there. This is their set of breakers for every one of the tanks, and this is probably the most important part, which is that over time we've learned that coral respond to light and that they spawn in particular behaviors. And so sometimes we can prompt coral to spawn in those behaviors, but to just keep them healthy, you want to keep them in the light that they prefer. They use live water, which is something not every aquarium does, but this is how they truck their water in. That's the Indian River right behind there. This is their water system. They will put those in the tanks and then circulate it for a while and then bleed about a third of it and bring more water in at any given time. And this is what the tank looks like now. Right? So when I say that it's kind of yellowish, sometimes people find it really ugly, but it's old. You know, it's been around since 1980, and it's been moved from Washington, D.C. to Florida, and it is just, it's amazing. There are these little bunnies on this side that they've just built into there, and they have like little dens. It's fantastic. And I used to sit there and watch it all day. But the other thing that this tank has done with long-term study is to show us something that we already knew, maybe a little bit earlier than we wanted to know it. So probably about a year after they moved it to Florida, it experienced a large die-off. You can see here that all of these coral were lost. And it's a little sad because the person who takes care of the tank now, who's such a lovely man, was just devastated. I mean, the way that we talk about mourning and the ocean is something that I think all of you can think about. But he mourns for these coral in a way that was very heart-wrenching. But all of these coral have been lost. So what this looks like now is very different than what it looks like when 80 built it. And we're still doing that with new tanks. So if you've been to the National Museum of Natural History, this is their coral tank now. They put in a Pacific tank because people think Pacific coral is a lot prettier. And it is, but you can see here, you can see this is a commercial coral tank cleaner. He comes in, and behind the scenes, there was a vet from the National Aquarium at Baltimore, and also a graduate student who does, she actually used to work for this company that runs the tank, but now she does microbiology. So what they were doing is, this is white band disease, very early. This was probably, not that long ago, but long enough ago that we were surprised by what it was. And you can see they've just continuously cut it off here. And so they're cutting off those areas, and then they were flash freezing them and sending them to George Washington for her to do some analysis of them. So maintenance and conservation are things that we talk about now with tanks that maybe even 10 years ago we couldn't have had this conversation in a big way. This is one of the coral nurseries that exists in Florida right now. There are a lot of them, and they are growing every day. So I was at a conference with someone a couple weeks ago, and her job is to just go around and help aquariums set up this place in the back. It's expensive, it takes very specialized knowledge to do, and it's not 100% clear what the end goal always is, right? Are we putting these coral out? Are we saving them for genetic, ARC capabilities? There are a couple different things. This was a paper written in 2015 about conservation of coral. There's two different ways that you might do this. One is fragging, right? So you have all the same genetically fragged coral. You take a piece of coral and you just cut it apart and then you grow those out. And that's really what this is here. It used to work a lot better in the sense that you were putting them in an environment. It was just that there wasn't enough coral and you were gonna go out there, you put it in a coral nursery, you'd let it grow a bit bigger and then you take it out and plant it on a rock and it would grow. That isn't working quite as well as it used to for a variety of reasons, most of them that I showed you earlier. And so you have people like Madeline van Oppen, who's in Australia. Her idea is to genetically modify coral, which is what we call assisted evolution in coral. And so these are coral that she's collected after a bleaching event. And what they do is go out after a bleaching event. They will find coral that hasn't bleached or has bleached less severely, bring it in and try to figure out genetically why they are special. If they can figure out the genetic components, which some people are trying to do, they're going to try to either splice genes into coral and have genomic coral that is heat resistant, or they will try to get this coral to sexually reproduce in the laboratory, right? So the kind of ultimate thing that they want to do is sexual reproduction. Coral is finicky. All of those light timers that I showed you, they are very sensitive to that. And so that is when they reproduce. Most people who work on coral go out into the field, but it's a lot of work, right? You just have to be there. And we were talking to someone recently, it was like 12 hours of just scooping things up in the ocean and then bringing them back and pipetting and doing whatever. And so there's a large group of people, including SECOR, which is sexual reproduction of coral, sexual coral reproduction, that are trying to do this in the laboratory. And they have had some luck. This is a pillar coral, which used to be a staple on the Atlantic reef. It is now, from what someone told me recently, gone. So this is the Tampa Aquarium. They were working with the Horniman Museum, and that's Jamie Craig's group. And he's had an enormous amount of luck in England with his Pacific coral and is trying to help people around the world. This is an Atlantic coral, and this is the first spawning that we've seen of it in captivity, right? If we can get this to happen consistently, it would be very good for genetic having kind of a group of genetic coral that are not all clones, and then we could start to work backwards from that to find, something that is heat resistant or white band disease resistant. So that's what they're trying to do here. And then, of course, the Florida Reef Track Rescue Project, which I said is just, it's taken off in a very big way. Has looped in an enormous amount of facilities in order to try to get groups involved so that they can have people just keeping coral for them because of that genetic diversity. We have a few coral that will reproduce in captivity, but in truth, they're a very small amount. And so until those things can really catch up, you have to have a group that's just keeping them. They're just keeping them in captivity. So, can tanks save coral? The answer is maybe, which is not a very good answer, but it's a really relatively new technology and technique, really struggling to keep up with the shifting ecosystem, right? So just when coral tanks learned how to keep coral in captivity for an extended period was pretty much right at the exact same time we saw the first bleaching events, right? And then you add on to that all of these different variables. Tanks aren't, we're still trying to figure out how to keep all the coral that we'd like to keep in a tank, right? Very limited species. The concentration, because the first coral tanks, most of them were kept by hobbyists, which is not a bad thing. They were doing an amazing thing, but they were doing something within the hobbyist community, and that hobbyist community was very interested in a pretty tank. And Pacific corals are much prettier, and they're actually a lot easier to keep. And so that community invented and developed an enormous amount of techniques to keep Pacific coral, and the Atlantic coral is really catching up. No one really wanted to keep them as much. Technology really requires input from a lot of users. So a lot of my work shows that today, when you have all these initiatives to do something with coral, we see a lot of technology startups right now. They're like, we're going to save coral, right? But they're only working with one particular group, and they've cut out hobbyists and they've cut out public aquariums, and they're just working with researchers, right? You really cannot do that, right? Because everyone does something a little bit differently. But if you're keeping a tank in a laboratory, you're writing papers about the tank, you're doing all this stuff, there's usually someone over there that's keeping the tank for you. And they're not writing any of their information down, and they're just doing it because they know how to do it, right? And those technicians are really, really important. So if you think that you're gonna kind of start up your way out of the extinction of an artificial or a reef, then you're kind of wrong about that. You need that technician. And so you need all of these people. They all have a place in this community. The tank cannot be standardized, and that's very frustrating for scientists. And then there's really slow progress, right? So you can get a lot of funding, and a lot of it's gonna fail because the tank is a tinkering device. And so is the ocean, really. They're not one-to-one at all. And facilities. So if you have an arc setting, you have to keep them for an extended period of time. They have to be light sensitive, they're temperature sensitive, they're highly expensive, right? So those two things are not separate, they just go together, they feed into each other in a very particular way. And so could we perhaps do this? Maybe. Is it right around the corner? No. Is it kind of fungible? No. You have to be really slow about it. And that's really upsetting to most people because as we are watching reefs disappear, we're not quite sure how to use this device to fix them. I'll stop stressing you out. So thank you very much to the Smithsonian. I was a pre-doctoral fellow there and a postdoctoral fellow. It was fantastic. And also the St. Lucie County Aquarium, where I did my work, the Aquarium of the Pacific, and very much so the UF Tropical Aquaculture Lab, who just let me come in and poke around all day their fish and told me anything I wanted to hear. They're incredibly fantastic people doing amazing work. So thank you.
That was amazing, so exciting. So we've got time for questions. Park has a question, Daryl, if you want to catch Park back there.
What led you to get into this? What happened to your brain?
Yeah. So I am part of a field called History of Science. I went to Florida State, and I was a literature major, which is like what you do when you can read and nothing else, which is fantastic. And then when I started looking at things, I got interested in history of medicine, which is what I came through. So I was a historian of biology and medicine. But when I went to Pennsylvania for my graduate work, I ended up kind of stumbling upon a woman named Ida Mellon. She's the first secretary of the New York Aquarium. She's a particularly interesting person. She's so unlikable. So historians usually work on people that they love, and this woman is just completely unlikable. But when I got into her papers, I was just astounded. First of all, because no one had done a lot of aquarium history. And some of that is because it's very difficult. Historians really like to be able to go into an archive and read a piece of paper and be like, history. That's where it is, right? The majority of the work that I did for my book was interviews. And I would go to aquarists and I would say, how did you learn this thing? And they often will misremember. So Jack Randall, who some of you might know, is an amazing fish photographer. I emailed him. He basically invented some very interesting fish photography. So he invented this thing where you take the fish out of the water and you very quickly pin it and then lacquer it and then take it back down and take a picture. And when I was in graduate school, I used to tell people, most of the pictures you've seen in a biology book of a fish that are perfect, they're dead. Yeah, and people were like, oh, you're a real bummer. But so I asked him, Jack, where did you learn, this technique? He told me he learned it from a guy that wasn't alive when he wrote this paper on it, right? And then I asked that guy, and he said, well, I learned it from Jack Randall, obviously. And I was like, well, that makes sense. Thank you. And so historians of science are very particularly ridiculous because if you look at the history of kind of like the nuclear bomb or something like that, you start to see a group of people working to standardize objects, and then they say, this is what an atom is, and this is what fusion is, and this is what's happening. That doesn't happen in this group. So I realized very early on that I was working with a group of people that were making knowledge, and a lot of the time, it was still very open to a lot of different groups, which is something we don't think about science very often, right? It was just super open. I want to volunteer at an aquarium for a while. I want to keep an aquarium at home. And then eventually you can, know the ocean in a way that people might not know the ocean otherwise. And that's just that's cool to me, because I'm not a scientist, right? I study scientists, or I say I study people who study the ocean. Right. So that's how I got into it. I started working on a lady that no one else liked. And she was so unlikable, and I was like, I'm gonna keep doing this forever. But every time I would show up to an aquarium, people would be like, wanna look at some fish? The people who work in those spaces, people who have home aquariums, people who have labs, they're just so excited that someone cares. They just want you to, they're just like, look what I did. And I'll be like, I would like to see what you did. So that's how I got into it, yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about the role of commercial aquaculture and commercial aquaculturists, especially because they have expertise at scale?
Yeah.
At doing this to scale.
It's fantastic. So, and unfortunately, that tracing that I did earlier about the clownfish, that's an amazing commercial aquaculture. So one of the things that I was tracing was there are two groups, one in Hawaii and one at UF, that are closing the cycle on a bunch of different ornamental fish. The way that Florida does it is fantastic. So the University of Florida has a lot of different people around. If you come in and you say, I've learned how to breed this particular fish that no one's ever done before, a flame angelfish or something like that, they'll say, cool. They'll work on it, they'll work out the breeding to make sure they understand it, and then they will pass it on to commercial breeders, and they will up that breeding. What they've done here is that they take eggs from SeaWorld, Disney, every major aquarium, and then they will work out the cycle for them and give them to commercial breeders, and then those commercial breeders sell those fish back as captive bred ornamental fish, and it creates this really beautiful economy in the middle of Florida that is amazing. Commercial breeders are incredibly important, and they fall into this category that I didn't put in that network. The same thing as that guy whose hand you saw, right? People who come in and clean your tanks, like people who commercially run those things, they're incredibly important to the system. They don't, in many ways, produce as much knowledge that circulates. And there's two reasons, but mostly it's because they want to make money off of that knowledge. And so with the clownfish, we got super lucky. And I say we got super lucky. I mean, as a historian, someone wrote something down, which to us is luck. Martin Moe and his co-author both closed the cycle on clownfish very quickly. They both started companies for it, and they both went bankrupt almost within like 5 or 10 years. And they did a really nice thing, which is that they published all their materials, which is something most people just never do in this field. And so the commercial industry is very useful, but it's not as useful to knowledge production. It's kind of the end of that knowledge production. So it stops circulating most of the time.
I just wanted to know how the coral restoration organizations figure into this. Things like Coral Restoration Foundation, Key Dives has eye care, Moat Marine Labs.
Yeah.
There's a lab down in Layton, and I know when the bleaching event happened, everyone kind of started working together. But are those groups included in some of these organizations that you've been talking about, and how so?
Yeah, so there's a bunch. The biggest one that I talked about is Sea Corps. They've been operating for a while. they fit into all the groups, right? Which is really interesting. They are their own little networks. And at first, they were their own networks within each group, which is that there was usually an academic biologist who was working on coral with their graduate students. They would have volunteer divers a lot of the time that were either going out to do gamete, collection or transplanting coral out. And then they're using aquarists very specifically to teach them how to keep the coral in captivity for an extended period of time, and also to come up with technologies that help them with that. So in Sea Corps, the two main people are from Cleveland, with an aquarium there, and they're just absolutely amazing at what they do. And one of the things I look at is, because there's nothing standardized, you just have to make it up as you go. They invented this circulation system for the polyps so they didn't stick to anything out of just like salad bowls that they got at the dollar store. And I was like, you guys are geniuses. Why are you doing all these things? But so they're their own little networks. Very recently, they have expanded. And they've expanded under umbrellas of networks that already exist. So like the AZA has gotten involved in Florida and has started to link all of those satellite communities together into one. It probably won't look any different from the inside that network, right? You still need those three groups to be doing those particular things. But yeah, they used to just be their own little individual networks. Yeah, the salad bowl thing is like my favorite.
Hello. I was just curious as to whether or not there's you're able to predict when a bleaching event will happen.
I would say all the time. Pretty much forever. So as a historian, we don't do any predictions. We're kind of total jerks about it. We're not fun at parties. It's not. I think what I will say is my work now, and it's not just mine, there are a couple other people that study coral networks, and they do amazing work. But one of the things that we've looked at is not predicting, but kind of understanding how people continue to work in this field when you know that it's going to happen, right? So who enters a field that you know is dying? And those things are really important. So when I talk about mourning, right, Bill Hoffman, who runs that St. Lucie County Aquarium, is just, he actually doesn't, he likes his tank now, but he loved the tank previously. And when that coral die-off happened, it just broke something inside of him. Like, he talks about it as mourning in a very particular way. He's like, I can't get too attached to the new tank because it's going to hurt my feelings when it dies, right? And so watching that happen as a historian and an anthropologist is more important to me than knowing what's going to happen in the future. How people are reacting to it right now is what's really there at the moment. But what's more interesting and more surprising is how many people continue to have optimism about reefs, even when you think that that's something that, how can you do that, right? How is that going to happen? And there is some differentials in that optimism. So for whatever reason, women have a tendency to be a bit more optimistic in the field than men do. And so I was partially trained by Nancy Knowlton, who was at the Smithsonian. And she's a huge fan of optimism, and she invented something called ocean optimism on Twitter. It's a hashtag. If there is any place for optimism or happiness on Twitter, that might be it. But some studies have shown that there is a slight differential there, and it's not quite sure why that is. But and she tells me a story. When you think about that being optimistic, she was a graduate student in the 70s and can remember the first bleaching event she ever was in. She jumped off the boat into bleached coral, I think in Jamaica, and they all scrambled back onto the boat because they actually thought it was a spill. They thought it was, yeah. So, for her to be a person who saw one of the first reported events to still working in the field, I think is more important than something like that. Yeah.
I've been diving in the Pacific. Oh, sorry. Is it? Go ahead. Okay. What you said about people think the coral in the Pacific is prettier than the Atlantic's got me kind of, I have feelings. But I wonder if that's the coral that everyone sees when they
Yes.
think this
Yes.
is what coral is supposed to look like.
Yes.
And then they come here and it doesn't look like that. They're already have kind of a disappointment, do they? Or how different does it like really look? And is that part of our, visit the Florida Keys?
Yeah, yeah.
As something that we should be thinking about when we prepare and manage expectations for when you come here and see the coral. There is coral to see, and yes, it's under stress and it's got some issues, but its baseline was something that is not what it looks like in the Pacific anyway.
Yeah. This is a big question. So the earliest images underwater of coral, which were really hard to take, right? So color photography is really far away. It's in the 1930s. And the first image that is of a fish comes from the Florida Keys because it's shallow enough. And you can see the flash. It's a 10-foot flash. That's how high they had to get it to be able to take a picture underwater, right? And so instead, there were a lot of people in Hollywood that were going to the Pacific and telling stories. And there's a reason why, obviously, because World War II, men were stationed in the Pacific. They had a lot of feelings about the Pacific. And so when they came home, they were making all of these images about it. And they were using tanks and actually were mislabeling coral. They would say a picture of the Atlantic, and it was actually Pacific coral, right? What you see when you work in aquariums is people are very attracted to Pacific coral, and the images like Finding Nemo and Finding Dory, those are all Pacific coral, right? I was like, eventually they'll get to the Atlantic in this movie, but they never did. They went around the world and it was always the Pacific. I was like, oh, how is that possible? I do think it's really important. You see on dive websites, I don't want to say that I was the first, but in a journal that I just published in, I used a Facebook, and there are people with emojis, and they're like, this is the ugliest coral I've ever seen. And it was like feedback on a dive, right? Because it was Atlantic. They were like, nothing was pretty, right? And so, yeah, managing those expectations, I think, are really important. I think people want to feel proud of the environment that they are in, and they just are not quite aware of what it is supposed to look like, right? Obviously, it's not supposed to look like, and I'll just use that in scare quotes, what it looks like right now, right? But this is what it looks like, and there are things there that belong there, right? But they don't look like a tank that you would see in. And aquariums can go a long way in this. I've talked about this in the past. Like, they can manage expectations, and they could also do more to educate people, right? So that St. Lucie County Aquarium, one of the best things about it is they only have one Pacific tank. It's really tiny, and it's all captive bred. Like, they're just there to fulfill that part of their network. Otherwise, everything is Atlantic, and most of it comes from the area that they're in. So they pick up juvenile fish, and then they return them when they're still not fully grown. So they're actually just like really integrated into that space. That's something aquariums can do, but it takes being very embedded into a community, right? And we're more used to going to zoos and aquariums that have whale sharks and elephants and all of those different things. And people are used to, thinking about that. So, yeah.
So you look at this from a historical sense. So when you look at a tank, right, do you see it mirroring the real world, or are the reefs in the tanks surviving better in the captive environment?
It depends. So one of the things that I talk about a lot, so we've been talking about the last couple of days and talks about citizen science. Hobbyists are not citizen scientists. They can be if they want to be, but they belong to a very discrete community that is doing something very important to them, right? What can you do? How can you push the limits? What can you keep in that tank? Coral tanks came about not because people wanted to save coral. It's because coral's really freaking hard to keep in a tank, and it's pretty, right? And so one of the things that tanks will do is they'll cut out pretty quickly things that they find to be hurting their aesthetic or their tank, or even just the balance of what they're trying to achieve. So if you get like fireworms in there, you're not gonna be like, this is nature. Let's let it take its course, everybody. Some people will do that, and one of the best tanks, Walter 80, who built that tank, built the tanks for Biosphere 2, which some of you might have heard of before. He was the main builder for those tanks. And when they ran Biosphere 2, that was one of the first times that they saw that it was such a good heat sink for carbon dioxide. Like, they would have died they broke the experiment like 7 times, but it would have been much worse if they didn't have the ocean in there. After that experiment was done, they just let it go, let it do whatever it did. And it was overrun by algae, and then it had all of these other problems. Just very recently, they've cleaned it up. But you can see that you can run those systems, and they can be microcosms, but it's not totally clear what you're getting out of it all the time. But the tanks that are kept primarily are balanced in a way so that you don't lose everything. There are a couple really cool experiments, though. So right across from the aquarium in Fort Pierce, there's actually, the Smithsonian has its laboratory, and they're using tanks to see how white band disease spreads. And so they have them set up in different ways with just water flow, with different temperatures and things like that, and have been doing cool stuff. So they are simulating an environment in a really cool way. The woman who runs it is named Valerie Paul. What's great about the Smithsonian, and I will say this, they are public, they're public, so you probably could drop in and be like, could I see your tanks? They are also outside, so if you wanted to just be like, what's going on over there? But there's something really, when I worked for the Smithsonian and I worked for UF, the reason that those spaces are so useful to me as a historian and as an anthropologist is that they are here to educate the public, and I just happen to be a public that's really interested in weird stuff, but I just count, and so they were like, come on in and we'll show you all these things. So you probably could, but you could definitely go to the aquarium across the street and just take your life into your own hand and walk right across 4 things of traffic in Florida.